Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Avodah Zarah Daf Samchet. This week's learning is sponsored by Danielle and Jason Friedman in honor of Annabelle Friedman on her Siyum of Masechet Rosh Hashanah on the occasion of her Bar Mitzvah, and in honor and appreciation of Rabbanit Michelle for inspiring and enabling multiple generations of women in our family and around the world to engage in Talmud study. Today's stuff is sponsored by the Hadran women of Long Island in memory of Meyer Sanders, Alava Shalom, beloved father of our friend and co-learner Tina Lamb. May the Torah learned today by all of us be a zchut for his neshama. Okay, reminder, we have a Siyum coming up on September 2nd, and we hope to see you all there on Zoom. And we're celebrating a Siyum Hashas with Terry Kravosha, which is very exciting. And we have a nice speaker coming, Kaya Eisenberg, and we're looking forward to the program. The other thing I want to mention is the Siyum for 2 weeks later, we're going to have a Siyum for Horayot and for all of Seder Nezikin. Horayot is a very short Masechet. So I recommend, it's a great opportunity to try to bring somebody into the learning, recommend to people. The best way to get people to learn is to word of mouth, seeing someone else who does it. So I recommend it's a good idea to encourage people to learn the new Masechet and quickly do a Siyum within 13 days. And besides, we'll have a Siyum on Zoom on the 14th of September, and we're having a special event in Jerusalem that everyone is invited to. It'll be in Hebrew, but I highly recommend anyone whose Hebrew is good enough to come and you're in Israel and can come. It'll be a very special event. All the details of that we'll advertise after the Siyum of Avodah Zarah, just so that we complete one and then move on to the next. But it's all planned, and we're hoping to have many of you join. Okay, with that, we're going to get started. We ended our sugya with this mouse. And in fact, my daughter was listening to me. She said, my youngest daughter, she said to me, ichs. She hears me talking about a mouse falling into the ichs, which is exactly what the Gemara was talking about, right? Ichs. I said, you've got it. That's it. That's what the Gemara is talking about. Ichs. Disgusting. So, for those who don't know the word ichs, it's the Hebrew word for ugh. Anyway, the Gemara was talking about the mouse falling into the beer. Now the Gemara moves into what if Yibaylehu, the last words in Samchet, Amud Nafal lego chalamai. What if it falls into chala is not chala? Chala with an aleph, we've seen this many times in the Gemara, is vinegar. What if it falls into vinegar? Now, what's the question if it falls into vinegar? Why would that be any different? So, good question. In fact, the Rashi and the Rabbit have different approaches to this. Rashi says, Mi amrin, on the first Rashi on the page, hachometz ta'amo kashet, ve'ein hasheretz mifigo latepotam. The vinegar is so strong that you won't even taste the mouse in the vinegar. That's Rashi's view of the question. The Rabbit says the other way. The Rabbit says that perhaps it's no tain tam lifgam. Well, it's not the other way, but what he's saying is it's a different question. That perhaps, okay, this is anyone who cooks understands, right? Cooking is all about chemical reactions between certain things, and that the combination of certain things will create a certain taste. The question is, what's the combo of vinegar and a mouse? Is it going to actually, is the mouse going to add a better taste to the vinegar? The vinegar is pretty, not such good taste as it is. So is the mouse going to add a better taste, or is the mouse actually going to make it worse? So that's his question. So whatever it is, the question is there going to be a different answer for this than for other things? Even the other thing, we had some debate about it, right? We ended the last sugya with and it's interesting the Rabbit says this because similar then to the end, what we saw yesterday's stuff, that perhaps Reb forbade it because he thought it actually added good taste to the beer and not bad taste like the sugya thought, right? So there was this also debate about what exactly happens. So we're going to see a variety of opinions. The first opinion they're going to bring is Rav Hillel. Amarle Rav Hillel le Rav Ashi. Rav Hillel said to Rav Ashi, and then you're going to see Rav Ashi's reaction. He says that's a bad proof. But Rav Hillel says to Rav Ashi, "Hava uvda be Rav Kahana v'asar Rav Kahana." This happened in Rav Kahana in his. We saw it happen. Someone asked a question, I guess, to Rav Kahana, and in his Beit Midrash, and he forbade it. Amarle says, "Don't prove it from there." Okay, and then we could say again, according to the Rabbah, that would be maybe a good taste to the vinegar. You have to remember also, the fact that they can ask to give good taste or bad taste is because they don't really know, because no one's willing to taste this, right? Because it's forbidden. Like, this is the whole question of taste and how we do taste in general that we've discussed before, but maybe it's a good time to review. Generally, we say 1 in 60, right? If you have 60 times the amount, it overpowers whatever taste there might be. Now, and in fact, Alana Stein Haynes' shiur went up this yesterday about specifically Tam Ki Ikar and that whole sugya from Daf Samach Zayin, but all connected to this. So it's good listen for right now. But the issue is that when there's when it gives taste into something, so we usually say 60 times. Now the real halacha is you should find a kfela aramai, a non-Jewish baker, to taste it and or cook, chef. Have them taste it and tell you, okay? Even taste, it's hard to taste, right? People taste differently, whatever. So the rabbis, in the event that you can't find someone to taste, and so basically we say 60 times for most things, okay? So the question is, does this fall into that general category or not? And again, the question could be more like the rabbit, is it good taste or bad taste? So it's unclear exactly what all the issues are, but they have this case in Rav Kana and he forbade it, so it must be, it's a problem. And maybe it gives more flavor than 1 in 60, and he didn't want to permit it at all. Amarle, he said, no, you can't quote from cases like that. You got the details wrong. Hahu imartute imartat. In that case, the mouse fell in and broke up into pieces, and there were chunks of the mouse. Okay, if it wasn't disgusting enough, there were chunks of the mouse inside. And the concern is that while drinking, you might actually eat a chunk. Now, Rashi points out, although some people disagree with this, but he says a sheretz is metame b'cha'adasha. It makes things impure, like if any bit of mouse, let's say, that's the size of a lentil, is already carries impurity, right? There's different shiurim for different things. And because of that, we assume that eating it also would be that small. And that's the problem, that there's these small chunks inside. They're not so big, but they're also not, it didn't dissolve completely. Okay, now the whole question about time is not when you're actually eating a piece that's forbidden. Normally you would have to eat a kazayit, but in the case of a sheretz, Rashi claims, this is debatable, but Rashi says it's b'chadasha, and therefore there's concern. You might swallow it without realizing. So what is the case that we're asking about then? So either it was dissolved completely, okay, and then all you would have is the tam, there's no mamash. This goes back to tam over the mamasho. Or the mouse fell in and then it was taken out, but it had already given flavor, right? It was whole. That's kind of what you would have imagined. The mouse was whole, fell in, gave some flavor because it cooked up with it. You took out the mouse and then. So they're saying don't prove from that case because that case isn't the case we're discussing. Okay, so let's go on and we'll see different opinions. Ravina Savar l'shi'uri b'mea v'chad. He wanted to up the ratio needed. He said, let's do it at 100 to 1. Okay, he says 101 because it means one isser, right? One measured isser, and then 100 times that of heter. If you have 100 to 1 instead of 60 to 1, we'll go with that here. Where does he come up with this number? It's not just a random number. It says lo gara mitruma. We'll put it at no worse than truma. Okay, we'll say it's like truma now. There's no connection between truma and this. Truma has nothing to do with how strong the flavor is or how, right? It's just giving an example. He says we have a precedent for this number, 100 to 1. Remember yesterday we ended with Orla and Kalei Karam that was 200 to 1. So this is a different exception. Let's go with truma. Okay, we're not going to make it any worse than truma, but we also won't make it any better. Titnan, how do we know? Because it says in the Mishna, truma ole bechad umea. If there's 100 times against the 1, then it's fine. So that's opinion number 1. Okay, we had opinion number 1 that we rejected. We just says it's forbidden no matter what. But then we say, no. That was a unique case. Now we're moving on to say 100 against it. Amalei Rav Tachlifa Bergiza le Ravina. But Rav Tachlifa engages in a debate with Ravina and says, Dilma ketavlin shel truma b'kdera dami. Maybe it's like a spice of truma. Now here it doesn't necessarily mean only truma, but any spice of something prohibited. Think about spices. Spices are very strong, okay? Especially if you take something sharp, really spicy. You add a little bit and you really feel it. Spices are in a different category. And he says, maybe this is like a spice. Dilo batil ta'amayu, that this taste is always there. There's no ratio that can actually neutralize it. And therefore, maybe it should be forbidden at any amount. So here's the debate so far, 100 to 1 or never nullified. And that would be of the opinion that the achbar had such a strong flavor, either combined with the vinegar creates a strong flavor, right? Or maybe against the vinegar, right? That somehow it because the vinegar has its flavor and the mouse has different flavor, maybe it's very strong inside. Rav Achai Shiur b'chala b'chamshin. He goes the opposite extreme. He says you don't even need 60, 50 is enough, because that goes to what we said before, perhaps, that, again, either just the chemical reaction of the two, you don't really taste the mouse, or maybe the vinegar is so strong, and maybe that's connected, but to the chemical reaction, but the vinegar is so strong that it overpowers and you don't really taste the mouse. Rav Shmuel, Bered Rav Ika, Shiur b'Shichra b'Shitin. He says, going back to the previous sugya, in beer it'll be 60. The Hilchata, now here comes the Hilchata. The Hilchata in a sugya, I just want to point out, is often later. Okay, the Gemara is made up of layers, different layers, both within the Amoraic time period and also some layers from after the Amoraic time period, after the year 500 to about 800 till the Gaonim. There were Sforim, they wrote things on the sides of the Gemara, and often it ends up in the printed text. And perhaps, not, we don't know, but often the Hilchata is kind of this later addition that was added to say the halacha is, because usually the Gemara doesn't tell you what the halacha is, although we will see later that we have an Amora saying what the halacha is, and that does happen sometimes. But this Hilchata is what we call the Stam de Gemara, okay, where it doesn't have an author, and often Sforaitic. Hilchata, idi b'shitin, both in the vinegar, in the beer, the mouse is 60, 1 in 60. V'chein kol isurin sheb'Torah. Okay, and here you have it. And all prohibited items in the Torah, obviously, except for the ones that we know there's exceptions, like truma and orla and kilei akarim, etc. But everything else, we're going to assume. We don't start saying, right? Could you imagine if every single time we had to say, this gives more flavor, so it's going to be 180 to 1, and this get right? Ein ladavar sof, as we say, there's no end to it. So they said all prohibited items are b'shishim. Okay. Now, yes, I see you wrote in the chat that not except chametz, right? Certain things forbid b'mashu. We have min b'mino. We're not talking about that. We're saying when something can be nullified, right? When there's taste in it, then, and it's not, doesn't have these unique exceptional rules like chametz, like all the other things that are more or less. But when we're talking about does something give taste in something, we're going to basically say it's 1 in 60. Okay, so after we had all this deliberation, maybe then, maybe that, well, we end up with, we're just going to go with 1 in 60. Now we move to the next Mishna. The next Mishna goes back to some topics we discussed previously. In fact, we're going to reference a sugya from Daf Lamed Aleph, so we're really going back but connected to the topic we've been in. If you remember, Yenesef came up earlier, and then we went back to it at the end of the Masechet. We have we're going to have 4 cases, but we're going to first start with the first 3, which are all kind of similar to each other and similar in structure, the way the Mishnah discusses them. So machloket about all of them, the first 3 cases, and then the 4th case will be a little bit different. The issue is Jew and non-Jew are together, and there's wine. Is there a concern that the non-Jew will do a libation if the Jew leaves the room, isn't there, right? Do you have to be watching it all the time? Or maybe not, okay? And then if not, well, how long would it take for the non-Jew to do a libation? And at least in the first case, for sure, we're talking about where it's sealed and it's closed, okay? And it's not easy to open. So there's a debate about the later cases. I'm not going to get into this. The Rabbit has a certain way of looking at it, whether maybe there's difference between case number 1 and case number 2 and 3 about whether they're easily openable or not, but I'm going to leave that question aside. But just know that there's a unique opinion about the Rabbit here. The Mishnah starts off with the first case. Oved kochavim shaya ma'avir im Yisrael kadei yain mimakom lamakom. Im Yisrael, they mean for the Israel. So we have a non-Jew who's basically moving the Jews' barrels of wine from place to place. So this case, you're going to see very hands-on. Okay, that's why the Rabbit distinguishes a little bit between this case and the next one, because they're actually touching the wine. I mean, they're touching the barrels. Now, the barrels, that's why the Rabbit said they're obviously completely sealed. If they weren't completely sealed, there'd be nothing to discuss. Obviously, it would be a problem, but they're moving the barrels. Im haya b'chezkat hamishtamer mutar. If it was in the, okay, this is going to be a hard thing to explain, and the Gemara is going to have to give us an explanation for this, but I'll already kind of give you the direction so you understand what we're saying. If the person who's mishtamer, that means basically the Jew, if the Jew, it's in his domains, or if the Jew is watching. Now, watching doesn't necessarily mean watching, okay? It means it's in the presumption. That's really the way to explain chizkat, presumption of watching. Now, what does that mean? This is like what we call a mashgiach in a restaurant. The mashgiach isn't there all the time, but the mashgiach can walk in at any time, and that's the way the Gemara is going to explain what this means. Okay, so if the Jew is in the vicinity or could be anytime in the vicinity, then we assume the non-Jew is working for the Jew and they know the rules. They're not going to start touching it. They'll lose their job. But im hodioshu maflig. But if the Jew says, listen, I'm going away for a while, okay? Kidei. So now, how much time does the non-Jew have to basically offer a libation? Well, this is the machloket. The first opinion says, Tanakama, or the rabbis, Kadeshi yishtom v'yistom v'yigov. It sounds like a play on words. Yishtom, yistom. Yishtom is, he can make, now again, this is sealed, it's got a cover. Now the assumption is the cover is made out of some material. We're going to see later. Is it limestone? Is it um, clay? Okay, but it's some sort of cover that you can theoretically make a hole in. Okay, now if you could make a hole, cover it up, let it dry. The assumption is once it dries, it'll look the same and no one will ever notice. And then we're going to have a whole discussion which material are we talking about, because not all materials are not noticeable when you make a hole. But obviously, Tanakama thinks this wouldn't be noticeable. If it would be noticeable, then of course you can't do it. Then of course it wouldn't be useful as an amount of time. We're going to talk about this right now. But basically, yishtom, you make a hole. Yistom, you will seal it up, and yigov, and it will dry. If there's enough time for the hole to be made, sealed up, and dried, then we're worried. And that's when the Jew says, I'm going away. If enough time passes that could have happened, we're concerned that this would be a problem. Rabban Shimon Gamliel Omer, Kadeshi yiftach et hachavit v'yigof v'tigof. He says, no. They'd have to open the barrel, completely destroy the cover, because if it's made of something that's right, earthenware, something in that department, it'll break. So basically, you open the seal, you break the cover, okay, because the only way to get it off apparently is to break it. I don't really follow the whole how this happens, because I'm trying to figure out how it gets broken and the pieces don't fall into the barrel of wine, but somehow you would break the seal. That would also break the cover somehow. And then you'd have to make a new cover, reseal it, okay, and it would dry. So that is a longer amount of time. So Rashbag is actually more lenient, because he says more time needs to pass for you to be concerned. So Rashbag, we're going to see exactly what Rashbag thinks, but he thinks somehow a hole would be noticed. And the rabbis somehow think a hole won't be noticed. We're going to have to discuss this, what exactly, right? Either it's noticed or it's not noticed. So that's the first case. The second case is, and we're going to see the exact same machloket in all three cases. And then the question of the Gemara is going to be, why do we need all three cases? If the halacha is the same in each, or at least the machloket is the same in each, what does each one add? We'll get to that later. Next case. Now, in this case, the non-Jew is not handling your wine at all. Okay, so it's a little bit different. You're in a wagon or in a boat with a non-Jew. You happen to be traveling together. And halach lo b'kapendaria. You took a shortcut. There's a famous word. Why? Because it comes up in a Mishna and Megillah. Quote often, it's about don't make a shul a kapendaria. You can't shortcut through the shul. This happens in my shul all the time. People shortcut through it. Right? It's a bit of an issue. You're not allowed to make a shul a shortcut to get from one place to the other. It's not respectful for the shul. Here we're saying, it's used a little differently here, but it's saying if he took a short way, in other words, the Jew went out for some, short detour, nichnas l'medina v'rachatz, even if he goes into the city, goes to the bathhouse, and some time elapses, but mutal. Why is it permitted? Because, again, the Jew could show up at any time. He didn't notice. He didn't tell the non-Jew he was going and for how long he was going. He just said, he just disappears for a little bit. Since the Jew could show up at any time, and the non-Jew also shouldn't be touching the Jew's wine. What does he have to do with the Jew's wine? So we're not worried anything's going to happen. But but if he says, listen, I'm out of here for a while, again, the two different opinions. Maybe, right, either enough time to bore a hole, fill it in, it'll dry, or enough time to actually cut the seal, open the cover, break it, build a new one, have it dry, seal it up, etc. Or seal it up, have it dry. Because if it's not dry, it'll be obvious, right? It'll be obvious that it was tampered with. Next case. I own a store, and in comes Novei Kochavim to my store. And I happen to go outside the store for a minute, okay? I go in, I go out. Mutal. We're not worried that the non-Jew has nothing to do with my wine. It's my store, right? They shouldn't be dealing with my wine at all. I go out since I could come at any time, right? They'll see if I walk back into the store and they're doing a libation to my wine, I'm gonna fine them for it. So I'm not worried. But but if I said I'm going out for a while, can you watch my stuff while I go out? Rabban Shimon Gamliel Okay, same two opinions. Fourth case. This one's a little bit different because we don't see the machloket here. I invite a non-Jew to dinner, and we're eating together. Here already, it's obviously going to be very different. I have jugs on the table. Villagin ala dublaki. And then I have some jugs on, according to the Koran, this means a side table. Okay, not where we're eating from, but some table on the side, maybe in another room, unclear. But on this dublaki. And I go out for a minute or a few minutes. Masha ala shulchan asur. Okay, now what's on the table is forbidden because if I invite you to dinner, I obviously assume, and I put wine on the table, that you're going to touch the wine. So, of course, if I go out even for a minute, there's a concern of the wine. Mutar. But again, you're in my house. Okay, this non-Jew is in my house. There's no concern that they're going to start touching other bottles of wine in my house, right? They're my guests. They're going to deal with what I put out on the table, not what's on the side. However, if I say, listen, you can dilute the wine and drink it, then it sounds like I'm giving them an open invitation to touch the wine that's not even on the table. Then I have to be concerned. So afshal the dubliki asur, even the wine on the dubliki is going to be forbidden. Because again, the whole thing is what's the expectation? They know they're a guest in my house and I'm allowing them certain things, but not other things. But if I open the door and say, you can even do that, well, then the assumption is they can take any wine, even the one not on the table. Presumably what's on the table is already diluted. So therefore, when I'm inviting them to dilute the wine, it sounds like I'm saying you can access any wine you want, or at least the wine that's, I don't think it means any wine in my wine cellar, but obviously it means the wine that's on the side. And now there's this line, which is unclear exactly what it relates to, but chaviyot ptuchot asurat, stumot mutarot, kadei shiftach v'yigof v'tigov. So if they're open, they're going to be forbidden, because obviously this whole thing is assuming they were somewhat closed, right? But if they're open, then of course we have to worry about a libation. But stumot, if they're sealed, they're going to be permitted as long as, right, there's enough time, not enough time for them to actually open, break the seal. Notice, by the way, and we're going to get back to this, this is Rashbag. Tanakama is not mentioned here. This is just saying Rashbag's opinion. You open it, right, enough time that they can open it, open the seal, break it, rebuild a new cover, and seal it up, and it'll dry. So now we're going to start with the Gemara. So we have 4 cases. 3 had a machloket, the 4th didn't have any machloket, and then we have this last line where it actually just mentioned Rashbag's opinion. So the first question, as I mentioned before, what does this mean b'cheskat mishtamer, which we know as, right, a regular mashgiach in a restaurant? We already know really what this means, but we're going to now explain it based on a braita. Keditanya, as it says in the following braita. Now this is a totally different case. And Rashi says it's completely different, and we're going to get to that in a minute. But I basically ask, okay, I'm very careful about keeping all my stuff pure. Remember, we learned a lot about purity and impurity, and that people would try to keep their stuff in purity. But then there were Amei Haaretz who don't, and the Amei Haaretz happen to be the people who are carrying the loads. So I give them my stuff to carry. They're carrying it, presumably in their hands, which Rashi basically says, we're not talking here, don't think we're talking like the Mishna, about sealed barrels, things like that. Rashi actually says, okay, he says it in the next the next words, Mishna Reisha, Mishna Sefer, but I'll already read it now. The second part of that Rashi, Hane lav chaviyot ninu sheyustumot. They're not sealed barrels. It's open items. They're holding them in their hands. Now, Amei Haaretz, we know, are not careful about Tum and Tara. So if they were carrying my loads that were taharot, afilu hiflig mehem yoter mimil, tarotav to'ora. If I'm going with them and then I go off, and I could even go a mile away, a meal is about a mile, go even a mile away, it doesn't matter. I don't have to worry that they made my stuff impure. But im amar lahem l'chuv ani ba acharechem, but if I say, listen, you go and I'll come later, as soon as they're out of eyesight, tarotav tameo, it's immediately tameh. So the Gemara asks, Mishna Reisha, Mishna Sefer. What's the difference between the Reisha and the Sefer? It's not really used in the regular term, the regular way this is used. Like usually that means why is this one permitted, this one forbidden? Now in the end, they're going to get to that. But what they're really asking, according to Rashi anyway, it's hard to understand in this context here, but because it's kind of obvious what the difference is. But Rashi says what they're really asking is, if assuming, and that's why I read this before, they're open, and we assume Amei Aretz, their hands are tamei, then if they're holding my open items, right, they're touching them directly, why in the first case are they permitted? They should be forbidden because it's an Ama Aretz who's not careful about Tumantara, and we should not, they're not forbidden, they're just Tameh. We should assume that they touch my stuff and it's Tameh. We see with our own eyes. It doesn't matter whether the Jews there, the Jews not there, their hands were Tameh. They touched, right, assuming, we assume an Ama Aretz is Stam Tameh. They're touching my items directly, no barrel, no closed seal. If it was a barrel, it would be a whole different story because if it was done from earthenware, you touch the outside, it's actually not tamei, and the top is sealed, and it wouldn't even be an issue because they couldn't even get to it if they wanted to be tamei, and it would be more complicated. But anyway, that we're not going to get into that. So now we have to figure out what's going on here. Why isn't it automatically tamei? So they're going to, and every answer, the answer is going to raise a problem with, and that's why in the end the question really is what's the difference between the Reisha and the Seifa? Because if we answer one thing, it's going to say, well, then why is the other case not the same? So let's try to figure out. It'll be a little back and forth till we understand completely. Amar Rav Yitzchak says, Reisha b'mitaherav chamarav u'po'alav lekach. The Reisha, when we say it's permitted, and we can assume they're tahor, is because, and it's again not permitted, but we assume they didn't make it impure, is because before they started carrying his load, the owner made sure they all went to the mikvah and became totally. Okay, that's a good answer, but what's the problem? So if the Jew disappears for a while and they're carrying the stuff on the load of the donkeys, what's going to change? Why is it going to be, right? Yahi sefanami. Right. Well, then the second case, even if the Jew disappears, what we're worried they're going to go somewhere, become impure just to then touch the stuff and ruin it. Not like a libation. With a libation, there's a concern. The non-Jew has this desire to offer the wine up as a libation to their God. Nobody has a desire to become impure. They're just not careful about it. But okay, but they're riding on the donkey. What's going to happen to them? So it doesn't make any sense. So they're going to say no, because it's very likely they'll come in contact with other people while they're riding. And they're not very careful about coming in contact with people who are impure. So they might actually touch someone who's impure, can pass on impurity to them, and they won't care. So it's very nice that the Jew made them become pure. And then, right, but then the Jew disappears. So who's to know what will happen then? Okay, well, this raises the question with the Reisha then. Well, if the Jew disappears for a minute, right? It could also happen that the Ama Aretz will become impure. If the Jew's watching the whole time, we understand the Jew will make sure they don't touch anybody else. But it takes a second to come in contact with someone impure. And if the Jew disappears for a minute, right, they could easily come in contact with someone who's not pure. And then they'll become impure and the Jew won't know. And why aren't we worried about that? So Amar Rava explains, turning out on a bet, bibalahem derech hakalatam. Remember, he hired them and he disappears for a minute, but he could come from a diagonal. He could come from any way. He could come and appear at any second. So yeah, they're going to be careful that they don't touch anyone when the Jew just disappears for a minute. And that goes again to this whole issue of the mashgiach. And now we're really getting to the core of it, even though we understood it from the beginning. But the Gemara was kind of struggling, wanted to understand it. We understood it because I read this and therefore explained it to you. If I hadn't said that, we wouldn't have really understood what does it mean b'chezkara mishtamer. And now they're saying, here's the model. This Braita discusses this model of a Jew disappearing but could come at any moment, and therefore the Amma Aretz is going to make sure they don't become impure to anyone else. But if they disappear for a while and say, they don't really disappear, they say, we're going away for a while, then the Amma Aretz isn't going to care anymore because the guy, what they don't know won't hurt them, right? But then the truth is the Gemara still asks, okay, maybe I should have waited one more minute to get to there because the Gemara says, now Lihachi Seifanami. Well, also the Seifa then, if they know they're working for the Jew and they can't become impure, well, then they know they can't become impure. What's the difference if the Jew's there, the Jew's not there? To which they say, no, Kivanda Amar Lechu, Ani Ba'acharechem, Sam Chadatayu. Since the Jew said I'm disappearing and I'm not coming back for a while, they assume the Jew's not coming back for a while and they can do whatever they want. Okay, and what the Jew doesn't know won't hurt the Jew, and that's the end of the sugya. So that explains what chizkara mishtamer is. Now we're going to go back to the Mishnah and go back to the three cases and explain I said we'll get to next, which is what's the need for the three cases. Okay, this is a very strange introduction. Usually you don't pay attention to these words, but I just want to point out one problem here. This quote from the Mishnah is a very strange quote. First of all, it ignores case number 1, even though the Gemara is totally going to deal with it. It actually uses case 3 first and then case 2. It's out of order. So the Bach changes the order, but besides changing the order, it should also have case number 1 mentioned here. That's just an aside. Utsricha. Why do you need all 3 cases? And now we'll review the 3 cases. The first case was when the Jew was having the non-Jew carry barrels of his or hers. So Itan Ovei Kochavim dissavar, which is really they're all about Ovei Kochavim, but they mean the Ovei Kochavim carrying the jugs of the Jew. Dissavar duma'ate v'chazele. There, they were just walking on the road. Now, when you're walking on the road, anyone can come at you at any point. You're very easily foundable. Okay? But if they're in a wagon or a boat, they can easily detour. They can go out into the depths of the water, and they can do whatever they want there, and the Jew won't be able to see them. So you might think, even if the Jew disappeared for a few minutes, right? Maybe there's no concern because they can veer to the side. And that assumes they're the driver, by the way. Okay, they have control at least over where the boat's going. But theoretically, you might have thought, and again, we don't, because if the Jew's going just for a few minutes and doesn't say they're going and doesn't say they're going for a long time, they could show up at any minute. And in any case, we're still worried. That's why you have to bring that case. That's what it adds to case 1. Now they say, right, Avid my Dubai means that he does what he does, meaning he can offer it as a libation when nobody's seeing. But no, we're not worried about that. The itani b'karona b'sfina. Now, if you said the karona in the sfina case, the wagon or the caravan and the boat, you could say mishum desaver dilma ate ba'orcha acharite v'kaya guda v'chazeli. Maybe there's a concern that the Jew could go some other way and stand on the banks of the river and see the boat, or follow them where they're going in the carriage and see from a distance. The Jew could stand at a high spot and have vision and be able to see where they are. So that won't necessarily help them, and that's why that case is going to be is not going to be a problem. You're not worried. But getting to case number 3, where they're in a store is different. Why? Well, in a store, you can close the door, right? A boat, imagine like a boat is an open boat, right? A carriage is usually an open carriage. In a store, you can close the door if there's no windows, or you can cover the windows, put the tree seam down. Nobody will see anything. So you can actually, theoretically, in a very short amount of time, close everything up and do what you want to do. So, Kamash Malan, that's why the Mishnah teaches you no. If you're worried the Jew's going to walk in at any minute, even in a store where you can hide and no one will know what you're doing, still we're not concerned. And that was the uniqueness of all 3 cases. Now we're going to get to the next section, which is I mentioned all this when we were in the Mishnah, which is number 1, we had to deal with what's chizkata mishtamer. What does that mean? And that's what we call mashgiach and all that. The next is why you need all 3 cases. The third thing we want to get to is in what case do they debate? The machloket between Tanakama about making a hole versus, right, is it the amount of time it takes to make a hole and seal it, or is it a longer amount of time to have to be concerned, meaning the more lenient opinion is Rashbag, which is unless you really break the seal and create a whole new seal from the beginning. With what material are they discussing? So it stayed in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Machloket b'shel seed. We're talking about lime plaster. Aval b'shel tit divrei hakol kadei shiftach v'yigof v'yigof. But if it's clay, what happens? Okay, you ever try to repaint a wall and just a small area, right? And you immediately see the difference between the old and the new. This is really what this sugya is all about, which is if you use, now we don't know these materials as well, what kind of clay they used, what kind of lime, what this lime plaster was. But the lime plaster is something that you could theoretically say, you won't see the difference. It could look the same. And that's why Tanakama says, theoretically, they can make a hole, seal it, dry, and it'll look the same. But clay, no way, no how. Everyone will notice clay. So there's no concern with clay. Even as everybody would agree with Rashbag, there would have to be to actually break the seal. Because if you bore a hole there, filled it in, it would be totally noticeable. And therefore, no one would ever do that because they'd know that the Jew would notice right away and suspect them. So therefore, there's no machloket. If it's seed, there's only machloket b'shaltit. Meitive. But now we have a problem because look at this other source. We have a source where instead of just saying this is Tanakama's opinion, this is Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel's opinion, there's actually a more of a discussion between them. And the part of the discussion that we're quoting now is Rashbag's response to Tanakama. And this is going to show or raise a difficulty on Rabbi Yochanan's answer because it takes a little while to understand this, but we'll see. Hello, situmo, or it should be actually shtumo, because remember those are the two same, right? One is a shim, one is a sin. Shtumo means the hole, stumo means the sealing of the hole. But it's really both, okay? The hole, okay, he says, but the hole, and it's the fixing of the hole, nikar will be noticed. This is what Rashbag says, hole is not going to work. Why? Because it's nikar beimi lamala beimi lamata. Okay, you have to understand a bit of reality here. It took me a little time to figure all this out, but the way I understand it is like this. There's this cover, right? And what they're doing is they're boring a hole in the cover, and then they're going to fill it in. Now there's lamala lamata. What's the lamala lamata? Lamala is the top part that you see from the outside, and lamala is what's underneath. If you open the cover, then you'll see the under part, the lamata part. So Rashbag says to the rabbis, now we don't know what material he's talking about, but he basically says, how could you possibly say they'll make a hole and won't be noticed? It's going to be noticed both at the top and at the bottom. So now what does this have to do with anything? Well, if you say the machlok is about clay, which Rabbi Yochanan said it's not about clay, that's the only case that makes sense. Because that's what we said before. Clay is noticeable on the top, right? You'll see it, and at the bottom. But now let's think about the seed. When would it be noticed, this lime plaster? Well, we already said if you fix it, you won't see it. Okay? So he says like this: if you said it's b'shalsi machloket, bishlama lamata yediyah. Now, actually, with the seed, this is a debate among like some explanations why exactly you'll see it milamata, but I'll try two explanations. If you seal it with this plaster at the top, the lime plaster, you won't see it at the top. You'll be able to make it smooth, and the color will blend right in. But when you open that, now either it's not going to fill the hole completely, or also you can't really sand it down because remember, the whole thing is you don't have to break it open. You're just boring a hole and fixing it. You can't fix it from the inside. You can't get down there to sand it and make it look good, right? I mean, I don't know if you sand lime plaster, but to whatever it needs to be to make it smooth, you won't be able to smooth it out underneath. Or some people say it just won't fill in completely. A hole doesn't fill in completely. Okay? So now go back to the Braita. Rashbag is disagreeing with Tanakama about which case? About the clay case. He's not disagreeing about the seed case. If he was disagreeing about the seed case, he would say, Aval Rishomoni Nikar Lamata. He'd say, but they'll notice it underneath. But that's not what he says. He said it'll be noticeable on the top and the bottom, which means he could only be talking about clay, which means they argue about clay, and that's not what Rabbi Yochanan said. So that's why we're going to say, all right, if you say b'shal seed, it doesn't make any sense. So now the Gemara is going to explain though. We're going to say like this. The machlok is really about seed, like Rabbi Yochanan said. Again, this is a way to read the Braita through Rabbi Yochanan's explanation. And this is the way you read Rashbag, which didn't make any sense a minute ago. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, who did lo yada my ka'amri Rabbanan? Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel didn't know what the rabbis said. Were they talking about teat? Were they talking about seed? Okay, now the rabbis were really talking about seed only, and that's why the machlok is only about seed. But Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel didn't know that. He thought maybe seed, maybe clay. So his reaction is, he says like this, and if you're talking about clay, for sure you're wrong, because that is 100% noticeable from every angle. But that wasn't even what they were talking about. But he says, if that's what you're talking about, that's what I have to say about that. And now, by the way, this is adding words to the Braita. This didn't say it, but this is how they read it. And if you're talking about the lime plaster, you might not notice it at the top. I'll agree with you about that. But when the Jew opens the barrel, he'll notice that there's a hole from the inside and that someone tampered with it. Right? You get medicine, right? You can see if it was tampered with or not. Or you bring home food from the store and there's something, right, open. So you can see, you might not see it from the moment you open it, but the moment you see it, but you'll see it later. So what did the rabbis react to that? Well, the rabbis would say, Rabbanit, kevan de milamala lo yedia lo masikadate de apich v'chazele. Either, this is option one, that the non-Jew will say, listen, it's not noticeable from the top. What you think the Jew, when he opens the barrel, is going to start checking? They don't pay attention that much. They'll see what's noticeable to the eye from the start, but they're not going to start looking underneath to see if it was tampered with from the inside. Or sometimes it actually could work perfectly smoothly, and therefore, right, that already could be a problem, because in some cases when they fill it in, it could end up really smooth and not noticeable at all. Okay, it's kind of a fluke, but it could happen. Because it could happen, therefore we have to be concerned for it. Okay, and that's the rabbi's reaction. And with that, we've resolved the difficulty against Rabbi Yochanan. Now we're going to finish up the last section with how we paskin. And I mentioned this before. Earlier in the sugya, we had a hilchata that was kind of an added of someone later on without a name. Here we have it in the name of Rava, one of the Amoraim, fourth generation. Halacha Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. He says we paskin like Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, which is the lenient opinion. Okay, that we only have to wait, and only if enough time passed that they actually could break it and rebuild the seal and all that, which is a longer period of time. Why? Why? Because the Stam Mishnah goes like, there's a Stam Mishnah that goes like Rabban Shimon Gamliel. What's Stam Mishnah? Our Mishnah. Remember the last line? Okay, to get to the last line, we're going to read actually the whole fourth case again. So this part will be easy. Ditnan, as it says in the Mishnah, if you're eating together on the table with him and you left jars on the table with wine, lagina ladubaki, and also on the side table, v'niach v'yatzan, the Jew leaves, mashal l'shulchan asur, mashal ladubaki mutar, what's on the table is forbidden, what's on the side table is permitted, v'im amar lo, havei mosek v'shoten, if he says, you can dilute the wine and drink it, afshal ladubaki asur, even the dubaki is forbidden, and then it says, this is the key line, chaviyot ptuchot asurot, right, if they're sealed, they're forbidden. I'm sorry, if they're open, they're forbidden. Stumot, if they're sealed, mutarot kadesh yiftach v'yigof v'tigov. Notice in that line in the Mishnah was saying, we hold the Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel because they didn't even mention Tanakama here. So the Gemara says, Pshita, Ravo, you're telling us something very obvious. We all noticed that Tanakama was absent at the end of the Mishnah and it was Rashbag, and we all could have come to the conclusion you did. I don't know when you read that and said, oh, that means the halacha came, but that's what they're saying. This is kind of basic. Why are you telling us something obvious? To which he says, Ma'u detema kula Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel katane la kamashmalan. Now, if you look, and maybe this is why they started quoting it from the beginning of case 4, because really that whole case 4 wasn't so relevant here. But if you go back, the line before case 4 is Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel omer kadesh yiftach v'yigof v'tigov. It was the end of case 3 was Rashbag's words. You might have thought if Rabbi hadn't told us this, that the whole continuation then was all in the voice of Rashbag only. Doesn't mean the Mishnah was Stam bringing his opinion. It was saying this was the end of the quote of Rashbag. The Rashbag then continued and brought that next case and ruled what he ruled and ended at the end with his comment. And maybe that whole thing was Rashbag. Comes the Gemara to say, no, that whole thing wasn't Rashbag. The whole thing was everyone. And this Mishnah said at the end, we're holding like Rashbag to tell you that that's the halacha. That's the way Rabbi reads the sugya. Now here comes the big bang at the end of the sugya and the fun part of our sugya. And this is really interesting for many reasons, and you'll see in a minute. Now comes the question of the Gemara. We don't know who's asking this question. We don't know when they're living. We can assume it's from Babylonia because we're in the Babylonian Talmud. It could be, it's a stam de Gemara. It could be much later. It could be between, like I said, for it 500 to 800. We don't know. But somebody comments this on the Gemara. It's kind of important to know when, but it's interesting. We don't know. The chime achar de kaimalan. Since we already just said that we hold like Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, then we're not worried about someone boring a hole. Okay, it has to be a much longer time to actually, break the seal, break the cover, rebuild a new cover, reseal, let it dry. That's a while. And going back to Sugya Amud Aleph, remember we had this whole thing about the seal barrel. You leave something in the Gentile's house. Do you have to worry that they unsealed it and resealed it, right? And they would forge your sit, right? There were some people who required 2 seals, a double seal. Some people said 1 is enough. So Rabbi Elazar said one is enough. We're not worried about that they're going to forge your seal on your wine, and you can leave it there. So therefore comes the question: if we're lenient like Rashbag and we're lenient like Rabbi Eliezer, Ha'idna nowadays, and we don't know what nowadays are. That's why I thought it would be interesting to know who's speaking. But nowadays, my time alone with why don't Jews leave their wine for non-Jews to watch? In other words, this shouldn't be such a problem. If it's closed, okay, it's sealed. We're talking about sealed. If it's sealed, why don't Jews do this, right? Often we have this with the Gemara. It's not so often, but sometimes. Like, okay, we paskin, and yet what we see people doing doesn't match. Now, often it's in the other direction, that people are more lenient. Why are they being more lenient when this is halacha? This is why are we being much more stringent than the halacha needs to be. Why don't people do this? Fascinating question. And the answer is even more interesting. Mishum shayaka. What's shayaka? I'll explain. It's called I hope I'm pronouncing it right, a bunghole. If it's a bunch hole, but people who are more up on the wine and the beer stuff, but you can look it up online and see it. I think it's a bunghole. They would put a hole in the side of the barrel or on top of the barrel for people to smell from, a small hole to smell the wine, to see what the smell is. So when you put this bunghole in, it's basically a hole, and it's very easy, much easier than what we've been discussing, to just widen it a little bit, put in a straw and drink from it. And if the non-Jew drinks from it, that will ruin the wine, right? Because then they could have offered it as a libation. Because it's very easy to do that, it's a problem. Okay, why is this so interesting? Well, first of all, why did the Mishna mention this? The Mishna goes, right? We went so far as to say you have to break the whole thing. So obviously, they didn't have bungholes in the day of the Mishnah. They didn't do that. And when reality changed, so the halacha changes because now there's more concern, right? And again, it doesn't always, reality changing doesn't always affect halacha. But in this case, people had to be more careful because this is all just practically. Can the non-Jew easily offer this stuff as a libation or not? Now, when they didn't have bungholes, so no, it wasn't so easy. Once they have bungholes, which whoever's talking now at this point in Babylonia, they had them. We don't know when they started and when this, but the point is, it's kind of irrelevant, everything that we learn now, because everything changes as soon as there's a bunghole and a very easy way to access. So it's super interesting in terms of number one, asking this question. Wait, we say this is the halacha, but it doesn't match the reality, and then figuring out why it doesn't match the reality. Okay, with that, we finish our sugya. Quick review. We started with the question about the mouse in the vinegar as compared to the mouse in the beer. And we ended up saying, in the end, we treat it the same, but there were a whole slew of different opinions. Then we got to these three cases in the Mishnah plus the fourth case about can we leave wine in the hands of a Gentile and worry or not worry that they're going to touch it or not, and then therefore offer it as a libation, and depends on the situation and depends on how you left and all that. If it's like a mashgiach, then we seem to be fine. So again, the Gemara split up into three parts. Number one, how do we define chizkat mishtamer, which, the mashgiach issue, the Jew being close enough. Number two, or even if they weren't close, but the non-Jew thought they could show up at any moment, versus they said, I'm going off for a while. Number two, we had what was the uniqueness of each of the cases. Actually, we have four parts. The third was what's the machloket, what's the scope of the machloket. Like yesterday, also, the way Rabbi Yochanan was dealing with what's the scope of the machloket, right? It's bishul seed, but it's not bishul tea, right? It's the lime plaster, not the clay, because that will be noticed. And then we had a difficulty, we resolved it. And the fourth part is how do we paskin? And then the more so, once we paskin, why doesn't what we see in reality match the psak? With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day.